The chapter that I've asked you to read for this week deals with the Industrial Revolution. It is kind of an antique in the sense that the term Industrial Revolution is losing its cachet. Excuse me, I want to turn this air conditioner off. The sound is too much. When I look at other textbooks, I find that some of them use the term, but they do not have a chapter using the term in the title. There's one that uses the term Industrial Revolution and also Industrious Revolution to say that, well, this is when people became heavily occupied with new businesses and manufacturers and so forth, but they were not but industrial does not pertain to that. So what is the problem here? I think part of the problem is that the United States and in many parts of Europe are post-industrial. When the term Industrial Revolution was in stronger favor, there was a notion that you could define the world as industrialized or non-industrialized. We had books that would, I remember a book in particular by a man named Schoberg who talked about, the title of the book was The Pre-Industrial City, where you would define what an industrial city was like, and then you see whether all cities that were not industrial had common features everywhere in the world. Or you would talk about industrializing countries or pre-industrial countries, but the assumption always was that to be industrialized, to be an industrial society, that was the top of the heap, as opposed to being a society that was at the cutting edge of financial services. So then when you have a country like the United States, where manufacturing has fallen dramatically, and financial services and other service occupations have become the mainstays of the economy, then you're a little less inclined to say, well, industry is the be-all and end-all of human achievement. Because industry, if it's now being pursued proportionally more in China and India and Brazil and Turkey and other industrializing societies, well, it may be that we had kind of a premature round of thinking when we were talking about industrialization being revolutionary. So now you have people who would say, well, is it right to call it a revolution? And of course you can chew on a term like that all day long, and you know, it's like an old piece of gum. You pretty quickly get less and less nourishment out of it. When did the term come into parlance? I found one source that said that it was coined by Arnold Toynbee, which would put it in the interwar period of the 20th century. Another source that says that it was a term used in the 1830s in Britain. Another one saying that it's a 19th century French term. So I'm not sure that you can find a specific individual who coined the term Industrial Revolution, but it certainly caught on. So the notion of an Industrial Revolution becomes a commonplace, and it's usually twinned with the French Revolution as being that period of revolutionary change. The scientific revolution is considered to be somewhat earlier, more in the 17th century than in the 18th century. There are phrases like the Second Industrial Revolution to refer to industries that arise in the late 20th century. So there are various bells and whistles that are put on this idea of industrial revolution. But I think there's no mistaking the fact that there was a time when industrialization was seen as the, as I say, as the be-all and end-all of human achievement. In the mid-19th century, there was a reference book published, a one-volume encyclopedia called Parley's Panorama and Curiosities of Nature. It was published in Cincinnati, I believe, and was a book that sold well to farm families in the Midwest as the repository of all knowledge. And it's an example of the idea that you could have all of the knowledge that we need to know in encyclopedic form sitting there in one volume in your parlor. What the Columbia Encyclopedia became in the 20th century when it still had a print version. Parley's Panorama has a coda at the end entitled Wonders of Half a Century, talking about the period 1800 to 1850. Steam navigation, canals, macadamized roads, railroads, electric telegraphy, balloon steaming, may we not soon add, have their entire history within the 19th century. To it also belongs, besides many other discoveries and inventions, photography, gun cotton, gutta percha, the preparation of various abundant but before unknown esculents for food, homeopathy, hydropathy, teaching of the blind, deaf and dumb, cure of the insane, association. Just association full stop. I have no idea what that means. Where am I? Here. Skip a little bit. Millions, well, I say, steam and electricity relieve the weary muscles of the toiling millions from Herculean labors and send them, after a fair day's work, into comfortable homes, with time and means to cultivate their better natures and taste the sweets of intellectual and moral recreation, freed by science from the delays of wind and tide and 1,000 obstacles which beset their path. Commerce hastens across the harmless seas or the level pathways of iron to pour plenty into every lap. The Reformation and consequent increase of intelligence among the masses had given a more thorough understanding of the practical principles of the Christian religion to the millions who had hitherto allowed others to do most of their Christianity for them. As a necessary consequence of this increased intelligence, the sympathies of the masses were enlarged. This is kind of your capsule story of the progress of Europe. The Reformation comes, it changes the moral outlook, it brings Christianity into a practical relationship to the real world. Things are invented, discoveries are made, and you have a kind of nirvana that is achieved through this process, which is already there by 1850. Presumably, if the term Industrial Revolution had in fact become known by the 1830s, presumably this was the frame of mind that led people to think of these incredible achievements as being revolutionary. And of course, one of the problems with today's revolution is that it might not seem so revolutionary tomorrow. So what we have in the chapter that I've asked you to read is a pretty extensive account of the Industrial Revolution, the early Industrial Revolution, with specific examples of specific industries and explaining what happened and contributing to the seemingly the message of the book that there was something special and dramatic that occurred in Europe and particularly in England in the late 18th and early 19th centuries that led to revolutionary changes that are unparalleled elsewhere. This argument for an industrial revolution has been profoundly challenged by world historians. The Great Divergence by Kenneth Pomerantz is devoted entirely to demonstrating that Europe and China really were not very different at that time. That if you look at levels of pay, levels of nutrition, levels of rates of innovation and so forth, that China was on a par with Europe, or on a near par, and that to the degree that there is some substance behind the notion that Europe came out way ahead, it is a consequence of Europe's extracting both wealth and goods from the New World. So for example, if he talks about English manufacturing, Pomerantz will talk about how you have goods that are produced, but agriculture does not grow. So that you have manufactured goods, but more and more food has to be imported. Because you can't, the productivity, the notion of productivity per person cannot be viewed simply in terms of a single, a single industry. You have to look at what is the productivity of the population across the board. Are they growing, having a harder time keeping up with the growing population with food? Whereas in China, they're keeping up well. How does that balance out things like industry? He points out that so much of the story of the Industrial Revolution relates to the growth of the cotton industry in Britain. That you have changes in spinning of thread and weaving of cloth and so on that lead to great cotton mills in places like Manchester, and that this is a revolutionary change. And that's the usual story. But then he will balance that and he'll say, that is true that there were huge changes in cotton manufacturing, but these did not apply to wool and linen. And England did not grow any cotton. So that as long as England had to import all of the cotton for its mills, you had, whereas it could grow flax domestically, and it could pasture sheep and get wool domestically. Was this so much a huge step forward, or simply a step that was making England more and more dependent upon colonial possessions, particularly in the United States, and then during the American Civil War, when the cotton industry was risked being crippled because of the cutoff in exports from the American South. That was the period of the great boom in Egyptian cotton, because the mills required it. So then there's a question, did people want to wear cotton, or did they want to wear linen, or did they want to wear wool? Manufactured cotton became comparatively cheap, but for a long time it was not dramatically cheaper than or of higher quality than fabricated cotton cloth that could be brought in from India or other places. So how important was cotton? Why is that singled out? It's singled out because it's such a clear-cut case, and yet often it'll be pointed out that the cotton mills were run by steam engines. Well, actually, a very large proportion of the cotton mills were run by water power. There is a peculiar emphasis put on steam power that seems to have captivated 19th century thinkers more than anything else, that steam was at the heart of the Industrial Revolution. Steam generated by burning coal, which was fairly easily mined in Britain. But when you look at the question of steam power, in places where coal was easily mined and easily accessed, then you might find steam ultimately being used for manufacturing. But in many other areas, it was water power. Virtually every city in Europe of any significance was on a body of water, a flowing water of some sort that could be used to generate power. Stories of the Industrial Revolution really don't talk much about water power. That appears to be something that's becoming obsolete. Steam is coming in. What could steam do that water power could not do? Well, initially, what it could do was be located somewhere else. I mean, fundamentally, what you have, whether you have a wheel that is turned by flowing water, or whether you have a wheel that is turned by the force of steam, you are turning rotational energy into some other kind of energy, either reciprocal energy going back and forth or gearing it down. So you use gears, you use belts that connect pulleys and wheels and so forth. The question of how you hook your machinery up is pretty much the same, whether the source of the energy is steam or water. And there isn't much innovation in that, but you have to have you have a larger and larger scale that is undertaken. If you go, say, to New England, a place like Lowell, Massachusetts, and you look at the old cotton mills that they have there, they're now turned into condominiums and local history museums, things like that. They're all sitting there right on the river. If they were using steam power, there was no reason to situate them on riverfront property. What you could do with steam, however, was put it on a wheeled platform and have the power of the steam being used to propel that platform, and that becomes the railroad. So I mentioned before, the precursor of the railroad is the carriage, so that the notion of a four-wheeled platform that you could put a steam engine on with all of the things involving inventions like brakes and suspension and steering, those were all there before the steam engine came along. And as it turned out, the steam engine could be used very well for railroads, less well for anything else. One of the few things that it seems to have been successful at was the steamroller, where you would, when you were building your roads and you needed to have your road flattened, a steamroller was of such weight that it had to have a steam engine that would push it slowly ahead to crush and level a surface. So that was a good thing for steam, but if you wanted to use it for something that would go faster, you had the problem that the engine itself was extremely heavy. For a steam engine, that's fine, because you're looking for a lot of weight. But for steam tractors or steam cars, by and large, steam was not very adaptable to anything but railroads. Although there you had a huge increase, particularly in Europe, because that is where the template of the railroad car was already in existence. Then you could put a steam in a boat, and you could have a steamship. That was perhaps the most important use of steam, because what it was replacing could not easily be replaced by anything else at that time. Steamboats were a revolutionary innovation, and they spread around the world fairly rapidly. But you generate steam, you can use your steam for various purposes, but if you compare the advent of steam to, let us say, the advent of electricity or of transmissible electricity, alternating current, the number of things that you end up being able to do with electricity is vastly greater than the number of things that you're able to do with steam. One way to look at this is to think, well, what would it be like if those things that we associate with our contemporary world had been thought of and exploited back when you had steam, but before you had electricity. And this is at the heart of a genre of counterfactual fantasy or science fiction works called steampunk, where you imagine what it would have been like to have kind of a world that we look at as being modern occurring in the steam age. The most interesting of those books that I'm aware of is one by two important cyberpunk authors, William Gibson and Bruce Sterling, called The Difference Engine. And they look back at the early 19th century work by Charles Babbage to invent what we would call a computer. And it never was brought to fruition. And what they imagine is that the computer, that is to say, a automated way of manipulating digitized information. They try and imagine what would it have been like if the computer had come into existence in the 1820s instead of after World War II. And so, of course, they have computers, but they operate with a great deal of noise because they're depending on steam for their power. So you have, like your screen will be made up of physical objects that will keep turning into like on one side it'll be dark, one will be light, say for a black and white screen, and then your steam power will determine what the pattern of white and black will be, so you can transmit information this way. And they visualize an information transformation of society going back to the 19th century. And you read it and you realize, well, what a preposterous idea that is. Because it would have been just unbelievably difficult to have made that happen. You would have, thousands of moving parts for everything, one or 1,000 of which are going to malfunction every few seconds. It's simply impossible. But this is one of the problems with the whole visualization of this, is that things came about that nobody had visualized and that were seen as transformative, and that people then extrapolated and said, well, if we have gone this far, well then surely we're on the way to something dramatically more. Like we have a revolution that isn't simply something new, but the threshold of something that will be continuously new from now on. In Pauley's panorama, their conjecture of a future when you'll have balloon steaming. They had balloons, they had steam engines. If you put a balloon in a steam engine, then you can have balloons steaming so long as you have an absolutely humongous amount of hydrogen to lift the steam engine off the ground, because of course it's extremely heavy. So there appears to have been in a sense, more anticipation than substance. And the question in my mind is, where does this sort of anticipation come from? Why did these new things come about when they did? Some things that came about that we find extraordinarily modern could have come about 500 years or 1,000 years earlier. If you take a stick and you attach to the end of the stick 4 things like veins coming out of or feathers coming out of an arrow. In other words, you have 4 square items that stick out at 90-degree angles to one another. And if you draw on each of those things that stick out a picture of someone or something moving, and you show the stages of that motion, if you rotate it in front of your face, you see the effect of motion. It's the closest thing we have now is a flip book, which of course could have been made at any time in history, as long as you had paper, for example. We have evidence, textual evidence, that the notion of motion that could be seen that way was there in Roman times. That people would say, oh, here's something you can do, and see, it looks like it moves. The origin of motion pictures in the 19th century, that's where it starts. It didn't require steam, it didn't require coal, it didn't require steel, it didn't require electricity. What it required was drawing pictures in a sequence that would show motion, putting them on, let's say, on the inside of a large diameter cylinder and having an aperture that you look through, and then turning it with a crank. Nothing, no sophisticated invention required other than thinking to do it. And people did that. They would say, okay, I can now show you a motion picture, and you can just turn this crank and you will see a picture move. And I know it works because when I taught a seminar in history of technology, one of the students built one, brought it into class, said, look through here. Oh, motion pictures. Why would anyone want to see a picture move? It would be a novelty. But the idea that you would take that novelty and then think expansively about where you might go with it, that's what seems to be involved in so much of this 19th century development. The enthusiasm for the new, the sense that we are living, or they were living then, in an age of extraordinary invention. Someone in that period developed the idea of a straddle bicycle, a two-wheeled thing with a saddle, with your feet touching the ground on either side if you wanted to put them down, no pedals, no gears, but kind of like, say, a large form of a razor scooter or a skateboard, a way where you could move faster on a level surface. We have pictures. We know that this was done. It didn't take off, but it was the sort of thing people were thinking of. They came up with new things. If you have people who are living in that period and where new things are being brought into being and being celebrated, why did it happen then and not earlier, in as much as the most of the things that come into being in addition to steam engines and steamboats don't require a technological breakthrough. I'm sort of stressing this because the tendency among historians is to say this is all derived from the history of science, and that you had Oxford and Cambridge graduates who would experiment with scientific things. They would discover laws of nature, and lo and behold, only 150 years later you would have some result of this. But I think that to some degree this concentration on what scientists do is unwarranted. It isn't thinking up something at the beginning. It's turning it into a useful application that will then spread and become a basis for an industry. Charles Darwin's grandfather thought of the idea that if you have a carriage and at the front wheels of the carriage, when you want the carriage to turn, normally you would turn the axle, pivot the axle. He thought, supposing you pivoted the wheels at either end of the axle, then you would have more stability, and it would be just a better way of steering. So he had one made for himself, and that was a carriage he used. Say, look, my carriage steers differently from your carriage. Oh, really? It does? Yeah, very interesting. But there was no industry. 60 years later or so, somebody else came up with the idea, and it turned into the basis for the steering systems we have in automobiles today. Having the idea did not lead inexorably to making the idea workable. Whether it was a question of scaling it up, or increasing the volume of production, or finding more efficient ways to do it, whatever it was. Probably most of the ideas that came along at that time never made it. So what determines whether ideas will prosper or not? Right now, if you read certain people who wring their hands about the American economy, they're continually saying, well, where will the next Steve Jobs come from? What will be our new industries? Are we preparing our students sufficiently to invent those new things that will bring back our industrial might and our dominance in the world, or are we simply letting all of our best minds go into financial services, and we're losing headway to people elsewhere in the world? And nobody seems to have a particular idea about how this process of innovation works. Now, the way it would work today, presumably, is not the same as it would have been in 1700. I don't mean to say that there's some sort of clear-cut answer. But clearly there has to be something that makes new ideas significant. And it's not obvious what it is, nor is it obvious that it's the same thing all the time. In studying the parallel commercial developments in China, it seems that many of the wealthiest industrialists in China in this period, say the early Qing dynasty after 1600, let's say by 1800, many of the wealthiest industrialists in China are people who own and operate salt wells in western China, in Sichuan province. A salt well is a hole bored down through stone down to 2,500 to 3,000 feet until it hits a layer of brine, water that is 13 or 14% salt. You bore this hole down, and it may take several years to bore the hole. And clearly there's a real premium on the people who have the skill or the sense of where such a hole might be successful in the way you would have now with the petroleum industry. So it takes a long time to bore the hole down, but then once you bored it down, you have a chamber, you lower it with a rope. When it gets down to the level of the brine, it sinks down into the salty water. There's a leather valve in the bottom. The chamber fills up with the water, and then when you start to pull it up, the valve closes. So you bring it to the top, and now you have a chamber full of salt water, and you empty it into a vat. You put the thing down again. In other words, no extraordinary technology, nothing like steam or something like that, but an enormous amount of enterprise devoted to making it happen. It was labor intensive, both to bore the hole and to extract the brine. It was capital intensive in that you had to pay that labor for a long period of time before the hole was completed, and you didn't know until you got there whether you were going to get brine at the end or not. But in western China, this was an important industry, and those industrialists became key elements of the growth of industry in China. My colleague Madeline Zellen has written a book on this called The Merchants of Zhejiang, where just the details about this. Other scholars have looked at Japan. They said, well, where did the industrialists come from there? It turns out a significant number of them start out brewing sake. They are brewers. That is not a science that requires some sort of great scientific breakthrough, although I suppose some sake is better than other sake. And maybe someone has special recipes that work better than others. But this is where you had the accumulation of money that led to some of the biggest industrial fortunes in China. So what you might guess at is that the people who make it happen, if that's the crucial element, those are people who are, probably not themselves scientists, may not themselves be people with advanced education, but they're people who get their hands dirty. They're people who know how a process operates, and they know it not simply by being an owner who has workers who are socially disconnected from the owner at a very profound level, but the industrialists themselves know how to do these things and to improve techniques and gradually acquire money. And then when they acquire money, what do you do when you acquire money if you acquire it from this sort of thing, from an industrial process? Can you become a Confucian gentleman? Well, maybe your son can be. You get him to study the classics and sit for the examination. Maybe that's not your goal. Can you take the son of a brewer of sake and have him become a samurai or a daimyo, a feudal lord in Japan? Well, probably not. So, in Europe, can someone who is an industrialist use that industry to become a nobleman, to become a duke or an earl or a major estate holder? In the 20th century, yes, you can be a beer lord. You have a huge brewery, and so you get on the Queen's list, and you get knighted as, Sir Budweiser of St. Louis or whatever. And but you go back to the period we're talking about, say 1750 to 1850, and it was very hard to rise in social rank in a well-stratified traditional European society. What you could do is simply expand your hold on what you were doing. In other words, you could have so many spindles that were spinning cotton thread, and you could multiply that. And now you have, instead of 1,000 spindles, you have 10,000 spindles, and then you have 20,000 spindles. You're producing more and more and more and more cotton thread, and you're selling that thread, so you're becoming richer and richer and richer. But the social stratification is against you when it comes to trading in that kind of that wealth for a change in social status. Some people could do it, some did not. Well, would you want to spend your time and effort increasing the number of spindles that were under your control? To me, this is a very puzzling thing. When you look at the non-noble population in Europe, the commoner population, you can divide it into people who work in the fields, and that would be your largest population. People who work with their hands, your artisan population, and people who work in buying and selling, your retail and banking population. We tend to celebrate, the bankers, and to talk about how from the 1600 on, the existence of joint stock companies made it possible for people to invest in enterprises that would pay them a dividend, and their money could multiply as a result of this investment. That was certainly true. But a lot of that investment was in trade. And by trade here, I mean both internal trade, buying and selling within a society, but also foreign trade. So the earliest joint stock companies, like the Dutch East India Company or the English East India Company or the English Moscow Company or Virginia Company, places like that, Massachusetts Bay Company. A lot of these were enterprises that expected to buy goods abroad, bring them back to Britain and sell them, or buy or produce goods abroad using the labor they had abroad, sell them somewhere else, and ultimately repatriate the profits to the shareholders in Europe. But the shareholders were not generally people who got their hands dirty. They weren't, some of them may have gone as gentlemen merchants who would go abroad and seek their fortunes. But many of the investors would simply be people who invested and hoped to get a profit out of it, and were not themselves the ones that made things happen. If you look at the farming population, their capacity to make things happen beyond their daily grind was very limited. If you look at the artisan population, now here you have something somewhat different. You have artisans who specialize in producing a certain thing, a shoe or a saddle, or a jar of or a cheese or something like that. Then you have artisans whose work is related to the work of other people, that they are facilitators of commercial activity as well as people doing it themselves. The most evident people in this category for this period of late 18th and early 19th century would be those people who work with fire, particularly smiths of various kinds, but also potters, people who know from personal experience how you know how hot an oven is, how you make it hotter, how much coal or wood you need to stoke that fire, how you design the kiln or the oven in which the fire will carry out its activity, and you're producing products from horseshoes to water jugs that people utilize, but you're also acquiring a particular expertise that is going to prove transferable to larger industries, metal industries, in the course of the Industrial Revolution, particularly the steel industry. Then you have the people who work with power, and those are notably people who operate windmills and water mills. A windmill or a water mill would turn a stone or turn a shaft, and that stone could grind grain. That is where the mills began, but that stone could also be geared to a saw, so you'd have a sawmill. Could be geared to a hammer, a trip hammer, so it'd pound paper pulp, for example. So you'd have a paper mill. It could be geared to various things to carry out some industrial process that otherwise would be done by hand. The millers were assisted when they first become prominent between, say, 1000 and 1300. They're assisted by requirements that come to be written into aristocratic relations with serfs that required that the residents of an estate bring their grain to the mill to be ground instead of grinding it themselves at home. This meant that you had the landowner who was in a position to impose requirements on his farmers, was helping the miller. He was bringing business to the mill. And he would often be also helping the miller to provide the money to build the mill in the first place, because it was a very expensive thing to build a mill. So you end up with millers and smiths sort of standing out among that stratum of population between the bankers and the trade merchants and the farmers. In that artisan middle ground, it's the millers and the smiths that stand out. I would argue that this stratum was terribly important in providing the social milieu in which the Industrial Revolution could take place, or in which the changes that we label Industrial Revolution could take place. They knew how processes worked. They accumulated a great deal of money if they were successful. They were not likely to rise into upper social ranks, and they tended to be distributed around the countryside. Say, unlike the bankers and the large commercial traders who bought and sold, who would be primarily in cities or in seaports, you had millers all over the place in the countryside, and you had smiths all over the place in the countryside. Fire and water are really the key elements here. One indication of this is how important these occupations came, as indicated by people adopting them as their surnames. You know, if you were, my name is, Frank the garbage collector, you didn't pass that name on to your kids. You know, we don't have any surname garbage collector or industrial or farm laborer or something like that. But we have a fair number of names that come from the artisan level, where people are indicating that coming from this sort of artisan background is appropriate, something they're proud of, and they're happy to pass on to their children. So one of the ways you can look at a ranking of this level of artisan skill or proto-industrial skill is to look at surnames. If you look at in the 2000 census for the United States, Smith is the most common surname in the United States. And Miller is the 7th most common surname. After that, you go down to 13 in order to get to Taylor, 34 to get to Wright, 38 to get to Baker. So Miller and Smith are the most common occupational names that we have as surnames in this country.
2007?
That's in 2000. Miller is ranked number 7. If you then go and you look at names of European immigrant groups, you'll find that there is a similar parallel, that in German families in this country, Schmidt is ranked 171, Müller is ranked 1198, Dutch Smit and Mulder, or you didn't know that Mulder was a Miller, X-Files guy. Ferraro versus Molinaro in Italian, Molinari in Italian, Herrera versus Molina in Spanish, Lefebvre versus Meunier in French, Kuznetsov versus Melnik in Russian, Kovac in Miller in Hungarian. The reason I did a calculation of this is because I was struck by the fact that there are no Arab Millers. So I looked at where does Smith show up among surnames in the United States, or the Arabic version of Smith, Haddad. Haddad or Haddad, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Well, it's not real high because we don't have that large an Arab population, but it's ranked 3,000 among surnames in 2000. As for the surname, the Arabic version of the surname Miller, which is Tahan, that shows up at 50,000. And there are only 2 or 3 families in the country that have the surname Tahan, and most of them apparently are Sephardic Jews from Spain, not from the Middle East. So I was interested in this, is that were there no Millers in the Middle East? Was there an absence of the social formation that contributed so strongly to the growth of industry in Europe? In other words, if you have an idea, who makes that idea happen? Who makes it real? I would say that it was the Smiths and the Millers who played very important roles here. But you had no Millers showing up at this level in the Middle East or North Africa, in the Arab world. That's what I'm checking on here. Persian and Turkish surnames are not normal before 1900, so you can't easily transfer it there. But the Arabic and the Arabic is common. Now, we know that the per capita consumption of grain in the Middle East and North Africa was roughly equivalent to the per capita consumption of grain in Europe. So they must have been milling grain at roughly the same per capita rate in Arab countries as they were in Europe. But nobody gets called a miller. You think, well, why is that? And the answer appears to be that the millers, the mills that you had, the people who ground grain. Oh, but by the way, technically, we have evidence that sawmills, paper mills, that the things you could do with a mill all existed in the medieval Middle East, at least as early as they existed in Europe. So it wasn't a matter of a lack of ingenuity of how to hook up a mill to some industrial process, but it was a matter of scale. A mill in the Middle East or North Africa was typically operated by an ox or a camel or a donkey. That you had a millstone, you had an arm that stuck out from the millstone, you attached your animal to the arm, and you had to go around and around and around and around and around until it dropped dead, and then you bought a new animal. There was no way you could scale that up from Morocco all the way across to Afghanistan. Industrial processes that require power use animal power, and animal power was incredibly cheap because these were lands that were semi-arid or desert, and the animals were raised with virtually no cost by pastoral nomads. So you'd have to pay money to replace the animal, but the animal would be extremely cheap. The nomads were not depending upon selling of animals for their livelihood because their wealth was determined by ownership of the animals, not by the sale of the animals. Nor did the nomads particularly want to accumulate a lot of goods. If you have a sack of gold, then you have to carry a sack of gold around with you, and gold is heavy. So you did not have the profit nexus that was making your animal power expensive. And in fact, the animal power was very cheap. So there was no impetus to develop a water mill system that would be a large fixed installation that would cost a great deal of investment in order to have as your basis for harnessing water power. The factories that were built during the Industrial Revolution were called mills. That is not a trivial observation. A factory, if you go back to the 1500s, 1600s, a factory was a word that applied to a overseas trading outpost of one of these European trading companies. Factory was not a place of manufacturing. It was a place where a factor, who would be the in-country operative of the business, would do his work. What we would call a factory, they called a mill, a cotton mill, sawmill, whatever. The reason they called it a mill was because that's how they started. The people who were most involved in many of these factories were people who had backgrounds coming from the harnessing of water power. Steam develops, I would suggest then, in substantial part because you had millers. You didn't have steamers. No, steamer never shows up as a last name. Boilermaker, not very common unless you're a graduate of Purdue, or they're Boilermakers. There isn't any very obvious surname that is related to steam, because unless somebody can think of one, because the people who had the knowledge of how to harness the power of steam were people who had already developed that skill in harnessing the power of running water. They knew the gears, they knew transmission belts, they knew how to hook up mechanical devices that would do all sorts of things. And I think that that the non-existence of millers in the Arab world made the progress of steam there almost non-existent, because you didn't have the right class of people to make it happen at a functional level. I don't know whether this is true or not. It's a conjecture on my part. But what it leads to is the idea that it isn't the investor necessarily, or the inventor, or the person who owns the operation but does not actually operate it, who's important, or the scientist who had an insight that later pays off in some sense. But I think that the social element that is crucial here is a mid-level, non-noble, artisan-based social stratum that is skilled in particular types of operations that can be scaled up and diversified in useful ways, or that provide the capital that allow them to finance other operations. Because once they have money, what are they going to do with the money if they can't exchange it for some dramatic increase in their social rank? So in Japan, it's sake brewers. In China, it's salt merchants. In Europe, it's who? I would suggest the Millers and the Smiths as being key figures here. This all relates to a historiographical question of whether when you look at a period of change, what is it? Let's say I'm a social historian more than an intellectual historian. What is it you look at? You look at the inventor. Do you look at the investor? Do you look at the scientist who had the insight? So if you take, say, a personal computer, do you say, well, who won the Nobel Prize for inventing the transistor? It was not the guy who invented the personal computer. You know, where did the money come from for Apple to get started? Well, we don't really care much about who the investors were. Nor was there particularly an invention there. Those things that were distinctive about the Macintosh had already been invented and put into use by the Xerox Corporation. You know, the mouse and the icons and so forth and so on. What Steve Jobs and his colleagues do is take off-the-shelf ideas and make them happen. And what Steve Gates and his colleagues do is that they take off-the-shelf ideas and make them happen less well. But in many, many industries, it's really that dirty hands stratum of people who know how to actually put things together and think about how to scale them up, how to market them, and so forth and so on. But that's the stratum that makes things happen. I've been thinking for some time about collecting instances of important inventions that did not work until there was a second invention, and saying, well, what is is there a class of inventions that are facilitating inventions? That thing wouldn't work until you had a second invention of some sort. And then who invented that? So it's usually the inventor who gets the credit. And somebody else, often somebody working for the inventor, who makes it work. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, which did not work in the way that we think of the telephone working, because you could not carry on, you did not want to carry on a conversation on a telephone. You had a device, it had a wire, it went to a central office, and you could talk to the central office, and they could talk to you. If you were having a dinner party, they could have a string quartet at the central office and play music, and you could pick up your telephone and you would have piped music into your dining room. That was actually an early service of the telephone industry. You could have it so that if there was a news report, your phone would ring and you'd pick it up, and the person in the central would say, you know, Archduke Ferdinand was just killed, or something like that. But you couldn't talk to another telephone. You could only talk to the central telephone because the switch hadn't been invented. So somebody working for Bell invents the switch that allows you to have subscriber A talk to subscriber B by going to the center, plugging in a plug, and hooking up with the other subscriber. That wasn't Bell. But without that, we don't have the telephone. We don't have the telephone. The Universal Product Code, the barcode, that was invented, 50, 60 years ago. I don't remember exactly when. It was originally a bullseye sort of thing with different thicknesses for the concentric circles. And you could read it by shining a light on it and it would reflect back, and you could put all the numerical information that we have on a product code now would show up then. And it worked. But it turned out that in order to get it to reflect, you had to have a light bulb of such high candle power that it generated enormous heat. So you couldn't put it in the supermarket because you were going to toast the products if you put them in front of this thing, and your checkout person was going to be, sweating buckets all day long because they're in a high temperature environment. So you could use it to sort railway cars where, you didn't have a closed environment. But it turned out that it was the facilitating invention was the cheap transistor. So that or the cheap laser rather. So that when you had a cheap laser that developed no general heat, then you could have the universal product code. So I think that historians of science are sometimes become obsessed with the intellectual breakthrough of a scientific discovery or the formation of a scientific law. But if you're looking at how the economy changes and how the society changes, I think that you really need to look at a different social stratum. And that in a way Europe was lucky because it had the enormous expansion of a stratum of millers coming out of the late Middle Ages that gave them a population that was capable of capitalizing on and commercializing ideas that may have come from various other sources. So the Industrial Revolution, clearly there is a change in the outlook, and I would suggest that that there's a change in the social status of people who are making these industrial advances, that they are becoming important in a way that is that's sort of scaling up from the importance they had before. In the novel by Sterling and Gibson I mentioned, you have in addition to the Lord spiritual who sit in the House of Lords, or the Lords temporal who hold land, you have the Lords scientific who are ennobled by their contributions to science. That's a fat chance. So maybe I'm just speaking here from my prejudice as a social historian. I think what we need to look at in these periods of change is much more the various social components of it, rather than looking simply at what happens in a scientific or a technological sense.